Trump has become president and England still haven't won the World Cup since '66. Coincidence? I think not. Abbas is in Redbridge to steer us back to the question about... I think the word is gaslighting, and I'm a little bit horrified this morning to realise that in some ways I've been gaslit too, and I'm someone who spends half of his life smugly pointing out how successfully other people have been gaslit. Abbas, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Thank you for allowing me to get on your show. Well, I'd like to quote somebody who I have a lot of respect for, very intellectual guy, and very, very colourful linguistic master at what he does. And he said that you can't reason somebody out of something that they've not been reasoned into. And of course I'm quoting you.
But it's not my... You're very kind, but that's not me. I can't believe I'm the... Well, I know for a fact I'm not the first person ever to say that, but I may have popularised it in some circles.
Yeah, I know. My friend said to me, oh, this is a James O'Brien quote. I thought, I'm going to use that next time I speak to him. So there you go. I think what you can do, however, is that you can do damage limitation.
Go on.
And damage limitation is basic, that you simply do not allow people to, encourage violence or excuse terrorism, regardless of where they come from. I've read some of the tweets recently and posts of people who were literally saying, well done, mate. You should have killed even more.
This is revenge. This is retaliation for terror attacks in which Muslims were also killed. I mean, as a Muslim, how do you even begin to square that circle? The first woman under the wheels of that truck in Nice was wearing a blinking headscarf, and 2 hours later, or 2 days later, Kelvin MacKenzie was suggesting that a woman in a headscarf shouldn't have been allowed to present the news.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, for me as a Muslim, it's vile when a supposed fellow Muslim justifies some horror like that.
Well, of course, I remember.
It's just vulgar, isn't it?
Yes, but it would be here. It would be, I condemn it completely, however, and I used to throw my breakfast at them when they rang in after terror, going back over a decade now. It would be an Islamist terror attack, and often young Muslim men would ring me up and they'd say, obviously I condemn it, but, and then say something about foreign policy, and I'd say there aren't any buts. You can be unhappy with foreign policy, you can condemn the terror attack, but you cannot say that you understand how one leads to the other, because that means you're on the same mental page as a terrorist. So the same is true now after New Zealand. You've got people all over social media applauding, understanding, explaining, saluting, and, as you say, encouraging. So this is the best example, Abbas, of my fear that the hole is too deep and too big now. How do you even begin to police what you've just described?
Well, I think that's a difficult one, because social media, obviously, is an incredibly difficult task. However, I believe that, the media in particular have a huge responsibility. And as you've already stated,
They don't.
They don't.
They don't take the responsibility. Why would they? There's money in it. There's money in whipping up this hatred.
We hide behind these, notions of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But I've been saying it for decades. I've phoned many of your colleagues as well. I think that when Ian Collins used to be on, and I explained to Ian as well that, look, every cause has an effect. And if we constantly feed this narrative, which is more often than not completely not accurate, inaccurate, that you're going to have an effect in the future where there will be a greater propensity for people to feel fearful, to feel like they're the other. It's not just that.
And
they will react.
Yes.
And this, what we're seeing now is that reaction, quite frankly.
And you cannot surely separate the two, however uncomfortable it makes you, if fully paid up members of the Conservative Party feel empowered and emboldened to write this stuff under their own real names, utterly identifiable stuff that even I think 3 years ago would have all been confined to Crusader 101 and, I'm an English Patriot.com. But they're doing it under their own names now on Facebook pages dedicated to the support of a prominent Conservative politician. That's too deep to climb out of, Abbas.
It's a tough one, but I think that doing nothing is obviously not an option. But I think holding, especially the press, accountable where something is provably...
But who holds the press accountable? Who holds the press accountable? I signed a letter the other day to Ipso, and I mean, that's meaningless. It's not really going to achieve anything, although I've been invited in for a meeting with the people that run it, so maybe there'll be some wiggle room there. But generally speaking, what happens to a bloke on The Sun who writes, what are we going to do? What will we do about the Muslim problem then? Because that deliberately implicates all Muslims in whatever the problem that day was. It's the Muslim problem. That's you, mate.
Absolutely.
That's you.
I totally agree with you, and that's where the accountability has to come in. And I'm not saying press censorship, but what I am saying is that when a story is found to be clearly untrue, where it's seen, by government to be something that's perpetuating and encouraging hatred, we
completely
need to take
untrue.
some sort of steps.
Completely untrue.
Sorry?
Second nature to these people. They print stuff that's completely untrue every day, and then they put a one-paragraph apology in 3 months later.
But I totally agree. And that's where the laws perhaps need to be tightened up. And I think that, at the moment we have certain laws, for example, that don't cover Muslims because it's regarded as a religion and not a race, and therefore it's sort of open season. I'll give you a little story. I drive for a living, and I had a chap in the back of the car. I dropped him off at one of the top bars in Mayfair, and he said to me, "Where are you from then?" And I said, I'm originally from India, but I was born here. And he goes, well, at least you're not Muslim. And and I was a little bit taken back, and I didn't want to be unkind. And I said, well, actually I am. And, all I would say to you is that, look, please don't believe what you hear, because we're just like normal people.
Is that the problem? Is that the problem with the metropolitan bubble? Is that people use it to describe those, the idea that the people in it are out of touch. But actually, you can't live in London or Birmingham without finding multiculturalism, diversity, Islam completely unthreatening. You can't walk up the Uxbridge Road or stroll through Lascelles in Birmingham, or go to go down Brick Lane, or go down Fallowfield. So the people who talk about the bubble are the people living in absolute isolation. It's the same as with immigration as it is with Islam.
But exactly, and where do they get their information from? And the problem here is, James, is that people often are not interested. You've seen it yourself, obviously, with these debates with Brexit.
Yes.
But people are no longer interested in data or facts. They're interested in just feeding their predispositions. And if they keep getting fed, and as you say, being gorged on these stories.
But their heroes do it as well. So the problem I have is the lazy presumption that it was confined to people who weren't that well educated or that well informed. But you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg now, within months of trying to topple Theresa May because her deal was so bad, he's now flirting with the idea of supporting it. You can't take against Doris in Ongar or John in Glasgow or Terry in Berkhamsted for being utterly inconsistent and essentially dishonest when their heroes do it every single day on the biggest media platforms in the country.
I'll give you one practical step, I think, James, that possibly people like yourself could do, is that invite, Muslim scholars who are clearly educated and can speak the language, and do a phone-in and let people ring in about what they're afraid of about Islam or what they think Islam means, and actually let them explain it. I think we don't get an opportunity very often to be able to do that. The only people that seem to get on the radio or get on the TV are raging nutters. And I think people then start feeling that's what
you're onto something, although very early on in my broadcasting career, very few people will remember this because the audience was about a fifth or less than what it is now. I did try to do that with anti-Semitism, and I did it in such a naive way, Abbas, that I ended up coming live on LBC and asking people to ring in and tell me why they hated Jews in those words. And I suspect that if I had then the profile that I have now, that could have bitten me on the backside in a rather unpleasant fashion, because people chose to pretend not to understand what I was asking. So I think Abbas is probably onto something, but what you don't want is a bunch of knuckle-draggers ringing in, claiming to have a better understanding of the Quran than people who've spent their whole lives following it.